Well, thank you very much, and sorry for the delay. Is it heard?
Yes. Perfect.
But it was much easier for me to use this than to be holding the microphone. And thank you all for coming and for joining us in this meeting convened by MISTRA, which I'm very glad to be here and to be here at the University of Johannesburg to speak about Cuba. This lecture or conversation takes place in the context of celebrating here in South Africa the 26th of July, the date put in one of the flags over there, which marks Cuba's National Day of Rebellion. It refers to the date, 26th of July, of the year 1953, when a group of roughly about 100 young men and women, led by a 26-year-old lawyer called Fidel Castro, assaulted the second most powerful military barracks in Cuba in order to start a revolution against a dictatorship that had been imposed in Cuba the previous year, violating the Cuban Constitution and the Cuban national order. The event ended in a military defeat. 75 of the assailants were tortured and murdered, and an important group, including Fidel and Raúl Castro, were sent to prison and released later as a result of an amnesty. 5 years, 5 months, and 5 days after that, they were back in power in Cuba as a result of a revolutionary movement, a guerrilla movement that they began in the eastern mountains of Cuba. Therefore, on January of 1959, the Cuban nation, with the triumph of the revolution, embarked on a quest to achieve our true and definitive independence, committed to build a fair and equitable society, and moved by a sense of solidarity, social justice, and, very important for us, national unity. This undertaking implied the daring challenge of trying to demonstrate if a small and backward nation of the Caribbean could overcome a history of exploitation, foreign domination, and neocolonial imposition in our country. And in addition to that, if it could take that challenge against the designs and vested interests of our closest neighbor, which is the United States, by the way, the most powerful nation in terms of economics, militarily, and technology then and still today. During these more than 55 years of hard effort, of sacrifice, and well-deserved achievements, that backward and underdeveloped nation of 1959 has accomplished a peculiar combination of remarkable and undisputable levels of justice, social advances, and fair distribution of wealth in the context of modest economic performance and evident economic hardships that have been shared by the majority of the population. The best illustration of this result is Cuba's high rank in the UN Human Development Index, to which I will refer a bit more later. And the best manifestation is Cuba's cooperation with over 60 nations of the third world, of the developing world, across the globe, basically in the areas where Cuba has excelled in terms of healthcare, education, culture, sports, and scientific research. We have done so with a notion of solidarity that has been shared among our people and that has been one of the foundations of the Cuban Revolution, and that has gone beyond our borders and allowed us the privilege, as a comment was mentioned a little while ago, of having contributed to the liberation of other nations and of helping to provide basic services and basic justice to millions of people in many parts of the world. The revolution also allowed Cuba the capacity and the willingness, but above all the freedom, to undertake a massive military effort that contributed dramatically to defend the territorial integrity of Angola, its independence, that contributed to the independence of Namibia, to the liberation of Zimbabwe, and that contributed to the defeat of apartheid's military machinery in Southern Africa. And I highlight that the revolution provided Cuba with the freedom to do that. The freedom to do that against pressures coming from the United States, against pressures coming from some European countries, and even sometimes against the efforts to deter us from our allies, the Soviet Union. If we would not have the freedom to act in that way, Cuba could not have been able to contribute to Africa the way it did so. Now, this willing and determined sacrifice by the people of Cuba has come with a cost. From the very beginning, US hostility against the Cuban Revolution served as punishment against the measures we took for equality, social justice, or independence in our country that inevitably came across the interest of transnational interests existing in Cuba, many of them Americans, or against the interests of established elites in our country that moved to the United States together with their interests. It went against our claim over our natural wealth from foreign owners, and it also served as punishment for Cuba's solidarity with liberation struggles both in Africa and in Latin America. Now, starting on the last decade of the previous century, in the beginning of the 1990s, the world changed dramatically for Cuba, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and of socialism in Eastern Europe. And it was a moment in which the US government decided to tighten the measures to strangulate the Cuban economy. So after almost 30 years of sustained growth, of improvement in the living conditions of the population, of investments in infrastructure, in social services, even in industry, Cuba was faced with a drop in its GDP of 34% between 1990 and 1994. And that was a dramatic blow to our economy. But we also saw the loss of the fundamental economic links that we had with the outside world, which at the time were with Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, the former socialist countries. To give you an idea of the impact of this, at the beginning of the 1960s, as a result of US sanctions, the US blockade against Cuba, and the opening of relations with Eastern Europe, the Cuban economy and its productive and technological base that operated fundamentally with standards, basically American standards and other Western standards, had to change dramatically and adopt in our investments, in our infrastructure, in our industry, standards that were European or Eastern European. 30 years later, at the beginning of the 1990s, we faced again the same reality. Those economic links did not exist anymore. At the time, neither the Soviet Union or Russia or the former Eastern socialist countries, none of them felt obligated with the commitments they have with Cuba. So our industrial base and our economic foundation again suffered the fact that the standards on which it had been built were anachronistic and weren't valuable anymore when we had to engage again with most of the Western world. Thus began, at the beginning of the 1990s, what we have termed the special period. It's a way that we've called it in Cuba, but it was a major economic crisis with important social implications for our nation. A condition of severe austerity, but yet equal distribution of the burden, and fundamental political effort to protect the revolution's social achievements. 24 years have gone by since then. So where are we now, after 24 years of this special period? And I'll use some facts to illustrate this. Cuba's GDP at current prices is roughly 71 billion US dollars. That would rank Cuba number 66 if you rank all the economies in the world. It means that we do not have a big economy. To give you an idea, South Africa ranks 29. Yet when you look at the impact of this in terms of the wealth of the country, the GDP per capita in Cuba at current prices would be 6,300 US dollars. That would rank Cuba number 92. Again, to give you an idea, a comparison with South Africa would rank 77. In other words, we do not have a big economy, and we do not have a wealthy country in terms of economic output. Yet when you look at social indicators, the picture is contrasting with the previous one. Life expectancy in Cuba at birth is above 78 years. That would rank Cuba number 38. In other words, in terms of our wealth, we rank numbers 92, but in terms of our life expectancy of our people, Cuba ranks number 38. South Africa doesn't have a good indicator on that subject, I won't mention it. Infant mortality, the infant mortality rate, a fundamental indicator of social justice in a country. In Cuba is 4.9 per thousand born. That places Cuba in between number 23 and 25 on take into account all countries in the world. A better rank than the United Kingdom, a better position than the United States, in par with the Netherlands, to give you an indicator. Our public health care system has been for a very long period free, public and universal. Our literacy rate is 98%. Our education is free, public and also universal. And Cuba's rank in the Human Development Index used by the UN is number 59. So you see the contrast between our limited economic strength and our unquestionable social achievements, which reflects a political will to expand social justice while we have not been able to produce a sound performance in terms of economic development. Therefore, one can say that Cuba's best asset as a nation is our human development, expressed above all in our strong human resources and our generalized equity. If you look at most indicators in the UN, Cuba is an anomaly because our economic performance are not the type that you would expect with the social achievements that Cuba has. If we rank above countries with similar GDP, or in Latin America, or even countries with a better GDP per capita than the ones we have. The UN has said, and I will quote, "For both societies and individuals, what is decisive is not the process of wealth maximization, but how they choose to convert income into human development." End of quote. Cuba has strongly believed in this principle many years before the UN pronounced it. Now, for the past 10 years, Cuba has had economic growth. There's no doubt that our economy has grown, but a very, very modest rate. Less than 1%, a little over 2%, the best has been close to 3%. For Cuba to achieve development, we need to jump for a sustained group of years to growth rates beyond 5%, 6 or 7%. Most countries need that, but that's what we understand and what we estimate for our nation. But we have what we consider 3 fundamental limitations to achieve that. And I'll explain the 3 of them. The first is the lack of significant natural resources. Cuba is a country that has no oil of significance, or natural gas, or coal, or sufficient rivers to generate hydropower. So in terms of energy, we're a country with great limitations. We do not have strong mineral resources. We have some nickel, which is very volatile in the market, but we do not have gold, platinum, uranium, copper, minerals that have a much greater value in the market. Therefore, we do not have a natural source of wealth creation, as other countries do. Other countries can create wealth and generate capital as a result of exporting its wealth in natural resources. It is not our case. And it's a reality that we cannot change. Our land is fertile, but it's a very, very thin topsoil, which can produce some products, but it cannot feed the country as a general, nor can Cuba become an important export of agricultural products, with the exception of sugar. And again, this is a reality that we cannot change. It's the heritage we have from nature, and it's an obstacle that will be there, and we'll have to deal with it as it is. A second fundamental obstacle is the US economic blockade. A policy very publicized, known about, but on many occasions misunderstood or insufficiently understood. First of all, it must be understood that it's a policy that has been in place for more than 50 years. And that it is the longest, perhaps, and the most comprehensive set of economic sanctions applied against any country in the history of the world. Secondly, that it's not a set of sanctions approved by the UN or any other international organization or any group of countries. It's a unilateral policy of one country, one powerful country, against a very small country. And that has a huge impact in the livelihood of Cubans, in our economic capabilities, and in our engagement and our relations with third countries. It does not only entail the prohibition of trading with the US. In other words, Cuba cannot export anything to the US, nor can it import anything from the US. But Cuba cannot import from any country any product that has at least 10% US spare parts or raw material or components or technology. Regardless of the relationship of Cuba with that country, regardless of the relationship of that country with the US. South Africa. If South Africa were to produce a product, a machinery, a food product, technology, whatever, if it has at least 10% of raw materials, spare parts, components, or technology originating in the US, regardless of our very good relationship with South Africa, it cannot be exported to Cuba. The same happens in terms of our exports to other countries. Cuba, for example, exports nickel. No product that contains Cuban nickel can enter the US market. The largest and the most lucrative market for any producer anywhere in the world. So you can imagine that our capability of placing our nickel in the market has huge limitations. Our access to financial resources in most parts of the world is very difficult, because most banks and financial institutions have close ties with the US. They are threatened or they fear to be blacklisted, and therefore Cuba's access to financing is severely limited. We receive no preferential credits from any financial institution. We haven't for the past 55 years. We have limits to our shipments. A ship from any country, a South African ship, if it touches a Cuban port, it cannot touch a US port for the next 180 days, 6 months. Now, how many countries from Africa, from Asia, or from Europe can take the luxury of traveling all the way across the Atlantic, go to Cuba, and then commit themselves not to touch a port of the largest market and the most lucrative market in the world? And we also face a constant persecution of Cuba's financial transactions anywhere in the world, regardless of the currency that we use. And we've had problems with that even here in South Africa, even in Brazil, in Ecuador, in friendly countries with Cuba. The aim of this policy has been to defeat the Cuban Revolution through provoking hardship, destitution, and hunger. I'm not describing it, it was described as such in 1964 by officials in the State Department at the time. And one can say that in its aim of producing regime change in Cuba, to use a modern term, it has failed. But it has been successful in creating hardships and creating limitations to Cuba. And again, as the first factor I mentioned, there's nothing that Cuba can do to change this reality. So this is a second fundamental obstacle that we have for our development, and there's nothing we can do. It's a unilateral policy, and there's nothing that we can do in our country to change. And the third fundamental obstacle is our great economic inefficiency. And there, it is our responsibility to act, and that's where we feel that we can act. And thus, that's where the updating of the Cuban socialist economic model comes into being. That is the basis for the kind of measures, transformations that have been carried out in Cuba in the past few years. Now, these transformations, and again, I'll use the term updating of the Cuban economic model. That's the term that we have chosen. The Chinese chose, I think it was reform or renovation. The Vietnamese said "Moi." We say updating of the Cuban socialist model. This is being applied as a result of a group of guidelines that were approved into law and that were the result of a very comprehensive and wide consultation taken with the population. In other words, a group of guidelines were proposed by a drafting committee. It was consulted through the unions, through the neighborhood organizations, through the Communist Party, through the women's organizations, through the Students' Federation, so that people could feed with their opinions and could propose, oppose, amend, or propose amendments to this guidelines. As a result of this very lengthy process, it was taken to a Congress of the Cuban Communist Party in 2011, and I think the statistic is that 72% of it were amended as a result of the consultation with the population. Most people concerned with the possibility that in seeking greater efficiency and in carrying out transformations that could provoke greater efficiency and efficacy in our economy, Cuba would be dismantling the social achievements and the social justice ensured by the revolution and by socialism in our nation. The aim of the guidelines have been and are to diversify our economy. In other words, Cuba cannot continue to be, as it's been in its whole history, dependent on one or two economic sectors for its development. Also, to diversify our foreign economic partners to the extent possible. To make the necessary structural adjustments that would release Cuba's productive forces, that as a result of outdated policies, or regulations as a result of measures, policies, and even regulations that we copied from other countries and that were not applicable to Cuba and perhaps not even applicable to those countries. To eliminate some of the measures that perhaps were relevant at a specific period or for a specific problem at some time and that continued to lapse, becoming an obstacle and a limitation for our development, and we failed to remove them in time. Both Fidel and Raúl Castro have said that our biggest mistake at the beginning of the revolution was to believe that somebody knew how to build socialism. And we learned that it's something still to be learned. And to be learned and applied within the context, the scenario, and the jurisdiction of each country. Another of the aims of these transformations and the guidelines are to protect Cuba's social achievements and to make sure that people's expectations are met in terms that the achievements and the social justice that we attain would not be removed or forgotten. And to say in the words of our president, to develop a prosperous and sustainable socialist society. We have followed three basic principles. First, that we will continue to defend and build a socialist economic system based on social ownership of the fundamental means of production. That's one principle. A second one is that we will continue to have a preponderance of planning and program over the role of the market. And I say this because we are introducing, and to some extent encouraging, market mechanisms to function in Cuba. But the principle is that we believe that the preponderance of planning and program for our development should be there. And the third principle, which I've already mentioned, is the sustainability of existing social programs and the achievements of the revolution as basic rights of the population. We became aware from the beginning and when we started that we needed to achieve, as I said, higher growth rates in our GDP, that we needed to liberate our productive forces. But also that to achieve that, we needed to separate, to detach the government's role and competence from the management of business, productions and services in the economy. And I will try to explain this in the Cuban context. For many years, we've been an economy that has worked almost totally as a state, not only owned, but run economy. In the 1960s, Cuba experimented perhaps the most radical property transformation in any country or in any revolution. By 1968, there was practically no private property in Cuba in economic terms, with the exception of agricultural land. The state was running barbershops, shoe shining shops, ironing, and the basic services. Any shop, everything was run by the government until recently, which, as you might imagine, has become and was very unproductive and inefficient. So one of the things we're doing is to separate the state from running the economy. It doesn't mean to separate the state from the ownership of property, but from running the economy. A basic pillar of our economy, we believe, is the state-owned big enterprise in the most important sectors of the economy where there's greater value added. But we're also stimulating non-state actors, what we in Cuba call cooperatives or self-employed. It's perhaps a euphemism for private activity, but it's how we name them in many sectors, not in the fundamental sectors of greater value added in the country. We are enhancing macroeconomic planning and programming as a government responsibility. But at the same time, we are permitting and encouraging market mechanisms to operate at the economic, at the business level, between entities both state-owned and private owned. We are trying to promote incentives for food production. As I said at the beginning, even though Cuba can never become sufficiently it cannot be self-sufficient in the totality for food production, we should be able to reduce the amount of imports on which our country depends for food availability. We need to upgrade our export capacity. Cuba is known for exporting rum, cigars, but these are not high-value products. Among the areas that most promising in this is the pharmaceutical and the biotech industry. And we also need to improve our energy matrix. To give you an idea, Cuba today, the electricity that we produce depends in 98% of hydrocarbons. That's oil and gas, most of which is imported. For us to develop, Cuba has to change this matrix and reduce that by 10, by 15, if possible by 20%. Looking at alternative sources, renewable sources. And another important element is that we need to solve the multiple problem of having multiple currencies and multiple exchange rates. And I'll explain this a little. In order to cope with the crisis of the 1990s, in Cuba, in addition to the national currency, which is the Cuban peso, we introduced what we call the convertible peso, which is a currency in parallel to the Cuban peso. That for most of the state activity operated on an exchange rate of 1-to-1, but in the private activity among the population at 24-to-1. But this is tied also to different prices for same products in our country. I'll give you an idea. Every Cuban, regardless of if he works or not, who he is, has a right to receive every month 6 pounds of sugar at a very subsidized prices, at prices far below the price of production, or the cost of production. Now, there's an economic law that says the price of a product should normally be a consequence of its cost of production. Well, we sold this to 11.2 million Cubans, regardless if they are a child, an elderly, if they're heavy, if they're diabetic, or they're sick, in jail, whatever. 6 pounds of sugar for each at a very subsidized price. Now, this same sugar is sold in what we call the farmer's market at a higher price, a price that is above the cost of production. And the same sugar is sold with convertible pesos in stores that operate with convertible pesos, with hard currency, at a much higher price than its cost of production. Now, it is naive to think that this same sugar does not meet in the real world. And therefore, you have for the same product, and you can repeat that with eggs, with flour, with salt, with basic machineries, with the goods that kids need for school, which becomes a huge mess in handling the economy. It becomes a huge challenge in even measuring our economy, in understanding which is the real size and which are the real figures in our economy. Well, that's a fundamental problem that we need to solve if we want to achieve greater economic growth, if we want to achieve greater efficiency, and if we want to do so protecting our social equality. Now, the characteristics of the process is that it is necessarily gradual. We cannot and we will not rush this. There's sometimes anxiety within Cuba and from outside Cuba because of the speed of the changes, because of the speed and of the transformations. But we cannot rush this. We have a population and we have an economy that is not wealthy, as I said. A mistake, a change could have a huge impact in important sectors of the economy, and it would not be fair to punish them or to damage them. And therefore, we have to be very careful in our balances. We do have concrete advances, and there's no doubt that have been steps taken that imply a transformation. I could say that the rate and the depth of transformation in Cuba in the past 5 years is only comparable in terms of rate and depth to the kinds of transformations that we had at the beginning of the revolution in the 1960s. Unfortunately, the impact on the lives of most people cannot be felt. And unfortunately, the impact in terms of the growth of the economy is not yet seen. The implementation is also monitored regularly. There's a government body presided by a vice president that has the main duty of implementing, of testing, of trial, of coming back, of correcting. It has to check and be accountable every week, every month to the Council of Ministers, every semester to the National Assembly, and of course also to the Communist Party of Cuba. Now, some achievements that we have already at the macroeconomic level. First, we've been building for the first time in more than 20 years a long-term development program, economic and social development program, marking the country's outlook for 2030. Any coincidence with the NDP here in South Africa is pure coincidence. But it's the same target date that we're looking at. In Cuba, in reality, has not worked with a long-term plan. Since 1990, we have been managing our crisis. We have been making great efforts, sacrifice, trying to survive economically. We have not been able to sit down and have a long-term view. The Council of Ministers last month approved the basis of this plan, which the government estimates will be ready in a year's time, measuring what Cuba should need in terms of population, wealth creation, energy, social services, investment, infrastructure, and so on. We've passed a new labor code because of the changes we're carrying out, in which we are putting incentives to non-state economic activity, therefore private activity. We've had to amend, practically change the totality of our labor code and incorporate some of the most advanced labor regulations of the world today. We've put in place a new tax law. In Cuba, for over 50 years, we don't pay taxes. The majority of Cubans receive a salary and don't pay tax. Own a home. Most homes in Cuba are privately owned. People don't pay tax on their property. And we've passed a new law that conceives taxes at all those stages, but that will be applied gradually. The law was passed last year, and it will take time for it to be applied for people. If people receive a very modest salary, it is not fair to tax them on top of that income. We've passed a new foreign investment law. It's not our first one. We have one from 1995, but this one improves in many areas, along with a clear definition of attracting foreign investment for the interests of what are development priorities of the country, allowing for greater transparency for the foreign partner, greater flexibility in terms of where it can operate, how it can remit its revenue, and how it can engage with government authorities at the local level and with the labor force. We've passed a new decree law on special development economic zone, which is a new figure in Cuba that didn't exist in the past, with the purpose of identifying 2 or 3 areas in the country. We've identified one now, where it can have special regulations, special taxing mechanisms as areas of high development and attracting foreign investment. And we have begun the actions to return the Cuban peso to its value and its role as the sole currency in the country. Now this is, I would say, at macroeconomic level. At the production, at the service level, we have, as I said at the beginning, one of our aims was to eliminate outdated and justified prohibitions. We have eliminated many. Someone that lived in Cuba and would go back after 5 years would see dramatic changes in that area. We have increased salaries by sectors. We have put in place a new salary legislation. To give you an example, as part of our beliefs in social equity, our problem is contrary to the one faced by most countries. The expansion or the difference between the minimum salary in Cuba and the maximum salary is very, very narrow. In some places, it's grossly huge, very unfair. In the case of Cuba, it's very narrow, becoming then unfair, becoming a lack of incentive for work, and becoming a way of insufficiently rewarding hard effort, skills, and people who are ready to work more. So we have changed our salary policy and regulations, expanding it, putting more groups, and encouraging people both to remain in the sector, to improve their skills, to educate more, etc. As a result of opening the economy for non-state sectors, Cuba has today close to 500,000 what we call self-employed, which is private workers that do not work for the state, and the aim is for that to be much higher. We've advanced in what we call the non-state production. We are promoting cooperatives of different types, for example, cooperatives outside of the agricultural sectors, which we didn't have. We are trying to, for example, most of what are services at the delivery service, like restaurants and small shops, all that not to be a state-owned or a state-run entity, but to be in small groups or small entities of people. And we are promoting also cooperatives in transportation, in production, in industry, etc. We have continued to distribute land to farmers. Basically, not the property of the land, but the usage of the land. We've had the experience that you start distributing land to a farmer that does not have the capacity to produce, it becomes for him an incentive to sell it. He continues to be a laborer without job, without a sense of sustenance, and it allows for wealth concentration. And one of the principles that we are keenly avoiding is set in policy and is set in legislation, is to avoid wealth concentration in Cuba. We have carried out a policy in the past 4 years of strict control over foreign financial assets and to normalize our relationship with our credits and to pay our credits in time and as expected. And we have made, to the extent of our limitations in terms of investment, an important investment in infrastructure, in terms of railways, water resources, and a new port in the western north part of Cuba, in Mariel, that should become a fundamental hub for Cuba's trade, and it should become, we expect, a fundamental hub for the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, as it is now. With the exception of ports in the US, it will become the largest port in the area of the Caribbean. We have also been undertaking some changes in terms of our government structure and performance. And we've started at the base level with 2 provinces in Cuba, Artemisa and Mayabeque, where we have been experimenting with new ways of the government role in those provinces, still within the current constitutional framework. We know that down the road, perhaps sooner than later, we will need constitutional reforms in Cuba. But we do not plan to, or we do not expect to make a change today and then next year make another one. We need to be clear on what is it that we're going to do, and it's going to carry, of course, a very wide and comprehensive consultation with the population if we're going to have important changes in our constitution. All the actions undertaken, as I've said, and I want to insist on this, have been with extreme considerations to the social well-being of the population and social justice. Cuba will not follow the path of shock therapy. It will take time, and it will require constant consultation with our people. We will still face the limitations of our energy dependency, of our lack of natural resources, or lack of capital, and the impact of the US sanctions. What we see is that, once again, Cuba faces the test of demonstrating if a small and underdeveloped country can overcome huge challenges in its ambition to secure independence and justice. In attempting to prove that socialism is viable, and in doing so under the noses of the US imperialism, which is not friendly to what we're doing. One can say that what I've explained And this, what I've just said, is the logic of the social and economic and political changes that are currently taking place in Cuba. Thank you very much.
Let me start by acknowledging the leadership of MISTRA, the Executive Director, Comrade Jewel, one of our own deep thinkers in our revolution, the stalwart of our liberation struggle, Comrade Isok Pat, Comrade Charles Situbi from our Central Committee, who's also present here. Some of our stalwarts, I've seen Comrade Barry Gilda, also the founding member of MISTRA, Comrade Abba, our Chief Operations at MISTRA, members of the diplomatic corps who are present here, of course, our ambassador, Comrade Carlos, and thanks for a very enlightening input. I want to start by saying, or by quoting, a regrettable excitement by Hillary Clinton when these measures of change in Cuba were announced by the revolution. And she applauded this by saying, even Cuba is changing. And the whole world said so. Yes, Cuba must change. The revolution happens in a sphere of change. There's no way in which you can have a revolution that doesn't change. But she was applauding this because she thought this was capitalist changes that were taking place. And the commander-in-chief, President Castro, Raul, came out to say, no. I am here to build socialism, not to destroy it. This is the foundation in which we should understand these changes taking place in Cuba. This is how we understand it. Of course, there are many issues that perhaps we have not deeply analyzed ourselves as to what do they mean in terms of changing the nature of Cuban society, which is socialist in its revolutionary perspectives, philosophical, ideological, social, and generally in its humanism. It's anchored on the philosophy of socialism, which is the philosophy of ending all forms of exploitations against humanity by other human beings. That's what socialism is about. So essentially, this is not a system you can fight against. It's a system you will fight for. So it is this brief basis that was explained by the leadership in Cuba that gives us satisfaction, Comrade Mkabisi. So I'm here to compliment Comrade Carlos rather to destroy what he said. But it's important to pose few questions. Amongst this will be this point that Comrade Carlos has raised, that Cuba is freeing the productive forces or liberating the productive forces. I want to understand, how do we liberate productive forces in a system where production relations are non-exploitative? We want to engage with this question with our comrades in Cuba. And I'm also glad that you have put congruent measures to respond to the non-interventionist function of the state in the economy, whilst you retain the fundamental basis of the economy, which is property. So you are protecting property relations in favor of the majority to enhance and advance socialism, whilst allowing private participation in the field of production. That is why it's critical also that we will want to engage with our comrades perhaps to study more about what will be the development, particularly in the microeconomic sphere, of these changes. You will note that economists, particularly bourgeois economists, have failed actually to respond to the critical challenge of responding sufficiently through microeconomic system to the needs of the people. They can only respond to the variables of economics. And this has been a major failure of the capitalist system in many parts of the world. So therefore, we're quite excited by these changes, also because we believe any revolution that seeks to be static will implode. A revolution should happen in a sphere of society. In fact, in the theater of society, it's where the revolution occurs. And there are many changes that I think that you have raised. There are some of the other things that obviously are similar challenges that we are facing. You have raised the challenge of incentivization of work. In our case, under a capitalist system, the incentivization program has been grossly exaggerated. That has created huge inequalities between the low earners and the highest earners. In some instances, some of our people here would have to live over 100 years just working to reach what others are earning in a single year. In your case, you say there's a small gap between the rich and the poor, or between on salaries. Essentially, I think that what is also important to reflect is that, which the capitalist world has failed to appreciate, is that there's a difference between equality or between the concept of equity in a socialist system and similar under capitalism. So in Cuba, my understanding is that you have almost achieved a sense of egalitarianism. So these measures are not meant to undo that, but to strengthen even the wealth of the Cuban society and Cuban revolution in comparison with the rest of the world. There are major lessons that, for instance, I want to point out, which I think we can learn from. We have spoken about massive consultation. Our revolution can learn from this. Our system of mass consultation is not mass-based. It's technocratic and bureaucratic. And we have developed quite impressive systems of consultations, starting at the ward level. We have ward committees, we develop IDPs at the level of the ward. These are processes of development in the local areas, but you still have communities responding to the government through protest because of lack of development. Whereas they were actually at the anchor point of that particular form of development. Whereas in Cuba, the consultation is so thorough, such that consciously, the people owned the process of development and its subsequent failures. For instance, part of the reason why Cuba, you will retain the statistics that you were sharing with us of having a higher quality of life as opposed to a country like us with so much wealth, is precisely because during the special period that you spoke about, the Cuban masses have told the revolution that they can compromise and cut every other thing else, as the GDP was declining at a rate of over 30%. They said, don't destroy our education and don't touch our health system. And that continued to expand. That is why today Cuba is able to export what the capitalist world calls human capital all over the world. Be it technicians, doctors, scholars in different fields and so forth, because those were not touched. The revolution said we can make sacrifices, but we must preserve this. In our case, I think that it's a major lesson for us that we hope our comrades in the alliance can actually embrace this particular framework. Of course, it will be important to also say these measures may not necessarily have been relevant now. Had it not been much about the atrocious American blockade on Cuba, economic blockade, that is extremely evil. The Helms-Burton Act measures that continued to throttle that economy, making it impossible for the economy to survive. And therefore, it was faced with these particular consequences. But nonetheless, from our side, we think it's an opportunity for the revolution to deepen itself. At the same time, we think that it's important that our revolution, perhaps in comparison with that of Cuba, can be more conscious. Conscious of what it can achieve and conscious of what it cannot achieve. We seem to reject, Joel will love this, long-term strategic planning as a society. Even when we embrace it, we want it to give results in the short term. The Cubans have appreciated long-term strategic planning. And even when they introduce measures, they prepare society. I will say, I guess we could do more in this field in our own revolution. Overall, I think we face similar challenges as humanity. Our destiny is the same. Therefore, the challenges that we face and the challenges faced by the Cuban Revolution are similar. But we can do more from our side with much resources. A small island country has shown the way how to respect life, how to preserve it, how to nurture it without huge resources. This is for me a major lesson for our revolution. I will not talk much perhaps from your point of view, because I think Comrade Carlos was also too modest about the achievements of the Cuban Revolution. But of course, maybe wanted to share much about what they are trying to do. The tax system. We want to learn more about this one. The tax system. In capitalist societies, it has dismally failed. Big corporates no longer appreciate the tax system as they used to. There are islands that do not tax big corporates. The big corporates now will go and proclaim their headquarters in different islands, small countries, that do not embrace the concept of the tax system. I hope we will not be caught in a time warp on this one, as a Cuban Revolution. But obviously, it's an important element, particularly if you are introducing private economy into the system. Therefore, we need to respond to that particular point. I think I still have 2 minutes. You were showing me 5 minutes. That should be 2 minutes. Okay. I think our last point, comrade, is that it's how Cuba can overcome what you call severe austerities. We are faced with that, despite operating in a relatively very rich economy. We have more severe austerities affecting our people than perhaps what it does to the Cuban population. And what to say to the comrades in Cuba, always remember that as we introduce these measures, the people should be the anchor of this discourse. If you leave the people behind, the imperialist forces, the Americans in particular, which had never liked that revolution, will be the first to make intervention as they have done in the past, but failed, and they will fail again. But they will be the first to create instability in that society because of these changes, because changes are quite difficult, particularly revolutionary changes. You will soon realize that our just 20 years of democracy, we've just seen over the last 2 days what a degeneration can mean when changes are not managed properly. People can turn the revolution or democracy into chaos. In Cuba, we have had democracy for too long. What we are dealing with are democratic changes in the sphere of economy and economic relations. It is in this regard that we want to say, we wish you the best and hope that we can continue to learn more lessons from these changes that you are implementing, so that ourselves in a future socialist South Africa will see what not to get rid of from the capitalist system that works. Thank you very much.